Hello and welcome to episode 42 of building a Flutter game, a 2D game which has multiplayer support. In the last episode, we basically had some success basically sending the angle to the server. So now the player angle is actually persisted on the server, and the server then sends back the state of the player with the rotation. And we were in the middle of trying to basically apply thrust. So when I press the up arrow or the W button, or if I would move my, on the phone, if I would move upwards, we wanted to apply thrust. And so we were in the middle of that. And so in this episode, we will hopefully get that implemented correctly. We're going to have to see where we're still missing something. And we're going to see then how we basically can apply thrust to this and send that to the server, and do that in a manner that we don't send messages all the time. We already started preparing that in the synchronizer. So if we look at the input synchronizer, we know that the synchronizer only sends the updates in the sync interval, which we set to 100 milliseconds at this point. So the problem here obviously is that the server will only even have that message sent to it after 100 milliseconds, and the message would travel a while, and so the server might actually get that message delayed. We're going to see what kind of effect that will have that we probably won't like, and maybe how we can mitigate that. So we have this kind of prepared. We basically, what we're doing is whenever the player applied thrust, we want to basically say that, okay, if the player already did apply thrust before, we just keep that as true, and if it hadn't been applied yet, we'll set it now to true, right? So then after 100 milliseconds, if within that 100 milliseconds the player did apply thrust one time, then we send that message to the server. That is the idea, and the reason is because we cannot just every time the player presses a button send something to the server. That would overwhelm the server if you do that all the time. So we kind of batching this up. So now, as we can see, this has no effect at this point. So what I want to work on first is try to get this in the player controller, try to get this at least to have an effect client side. So when we apply thrust, we actually should increase the velocity here. And so I'm not entirely sure why this doesn't happen. So basically, when we press up key, it should apply thrust. So let's start looking at the input processor, actually, where we're processing the keys. So here we're saying if the keys contain game key.up, then we should apply thrust, right? So what we'll do is we'll add a logger here. I think I called it logger, and that would be from the input processor. And so now, why is it not liking us? Maybe we pulled in the wrong logger, I think. Yeah, we don't want that logger. We want our, and I think we called it log, and that's what's confused. Okay, so now we have a log, and I will just basically whenever we have a key up, we're going to say log. Let's do finer. Let's just say up, right? So now we should be able to just refresh this game here. And we should see logs now if I press up. And we do see that. And we actually see that it's multiple times. So it's actually good that we don't send it all the time. And we already had this problem actually when we were still even not sending anything to the server, had no connection to the server. We saw that we actually applied up multiple times, because if it was pressed and the game loop picked it up multiple times, we got multiple thrusts, which is actually a little bit unrealistic, right? Because it should probably cannot apply thrust all the time. So we are getting this. So then we are setting player applied thrust to true. Okay, so that should work, right? And then in the input synchronizer, we should basically set this to true if the player ever applied thrust. So let's actually look at whenever we're sending this to the server, which is every 100 milliseconds, we can log out that we are sending this. So, or like that we are sending applied thrust, right? So if you do this, and this will be from input synchronizer, all right, and yep, and we have to import this guy. All right, and then we'll say basically and then we just pass the inputs, and obviously for that we'll have to implement inputs .toString. So let's look at that right now. So the player inputs, we can add a toString method, and we'll apply the angle and the thrust for now. That should be fine. Okay. So obviously we want to make sure that we don't toString. We want to kind of have fixed. toString is fixed, and we want to kind of just have 2 digits, right? Because we're also only sending 2 digits. So this is not happy because we are going past the column number. All right. So now we have that, and now we should be able to launch this again. We might even just restart like this, and now we can see that we're submitting applied thrust false, and now we should have submitted at least one time true, and we don't. So I'm applying thrust, right, and we're not submitting true ever. Or maybe we are, and I just didn't see it, but or what we can actually do, if inputs dot applied thrust, then we log out. And this way we make sure that we only log. So see, we never log. Okay, so something is wrong here. Something is not working. So let's look at here. Okay. So we are setting it. And it could be that we're not even setting it correctly on the client, so we don't even have to worry yet if we're sending it to the server correctly. So okay, so one doesn't want the plus. Let's think about this. What we could do is we could also we could log basically if we are applying thrust here, right? We'd say the field. We want to see what the field is. Actually, we probably should also just debug, but for now we are fine with logging. If we can't solve this in a little bit, I'm actually going to have to restart the app in debug mode so we can log it. But for now, okay, so field false, right? Now if I apply thrust, it never gets set to true, and that's the problem. See that? Okay, so now we know what's the problem is. We're never setting this here. Okay. So remove this, and let's look again at the player controller. When are we actually updating this, right? We're updating this in the update method inside the client game. And so we're updating, and we should have updated the client player. So apparently this never gets set here. Even though we know it does get, so we know this one was got set, right? So we're setting it here, and then when we update the game controller, maybe that's what the problem is. Maybe there we're setting it to false again. Yeah, there you go, right? So that's the problem. So actually, what we need to do is then do this first. Right, because we want to, and that's like where it gets tricky, right? When you have basically mutable data structures, right? And now the order of when you set things kind of matters because, so basically, but it kind of makes sense that once we process the keys, then we want to synchronize them, and then maybe we let the game controller update. And the idea here is the game controller, once it applied thrust to the player, increase the velocity. And that's when it basically wants to then set it to false again because we only want to apply thrust once. So let's now restart this, and now we should actually have better results. Okay, so we have applied thrust true, right? But the client basically doesn't see the result yet, right? So basically, but we have some success here, right? At least now we are sending the right things to the client, or at least we think we are. Like at least the inputs that we are sending at that moment have the right data in it. So and the other thing is obviously like we need to only send the update whenever the inputs have actually changed. So right now we said inputs are applied thrust, but what we can actually do is we could store the last inputs in a data structure, the last ones that we sent, and basically instead of sending something every 100 milliseconds, if nothing changed, right, we don't need to even send it, even if the time elapsed, right? So what we can do, we can say player inputs. We can say last send inputs, right? And so what we can do is we can say we want to override equals. To override equals, we also have to override hash, unfortunately. So I don't even want to override necessarily equals. We have like two values in here. So I don't want to use a library for this. So I'm going to use, I'm going to look at how we properly override equals in Dart. Because I know that it's a little tricky. You have to, whenever you override equals, you also have to override the hash code. Even though sometimes it might not even make a difference, but that's just the correct thing to do, so we'll do the correct thing. Yeah, this one didn't help too much. So where's the over? So let's just see if maybe if we are. So actually, before I do that, I want to actually check in what we have so far. So. Where did I just make a change? So this one I'll remove for now, and actually we will check the current changes in. Or like no processing, right? And you might ask, like, why are we even applying this thrust to the player? Well, because we want to probably show the effect right away, right? We want to show the effect that a thrust was applied immediately. So why that's not happening, we have to figure out as well. But we'll get to that later. Like basically, when the player applied thrust, we have to. In another update where basically the UI will update, we have to basically. So I think actually what we should do is. Yeah, we need to figure out like how to do this correctly, because right now basically in the controller we are unsetting it, so that's why we don't even see the effect, right? And it's because we have the controller separated from the from basically the renderer. So the renderer still the renderer. By the time we get to the renderer, the player already has not applied thrust. So we need to see what we can do about that. But for now, we'll focus on the other things that we wanted to do. So let's get back to here. So I'm actually going to go to player inputs, and I'm going to see if I can overwrite hash and so there you go, equals and hash code, and we want to include these. So maybe the generated code will just be fine. So that seems fine to me for now at least. And so now we can basically say in our synchronizer, we can say that if the time next thing is greater 0 return, or if what you can also do, we can say if what I want to do is I don't want to like keep counting down and down and down and down, right? So what we actually want is we want to use like the minimum should be 0, right? We don't want to keep going it doesn't matter how long we didn't apply the thrust for. So I'm going to say is the min of, no, sorry, the max of 0 and time to next sync minus this. And then we have to import math. So so now basically at least like we don't get into 0, which I mean technically it doesn't probably matter, or practically it doesn't matter. Technically it does, because if the game is running long enough and we never send the inputs, we could technically run run out of, like, or underrun, I guess, the number, right? We could basically have a negative value that's smaller than actually fits into a double, right? Practically that probably would never happen though. So now what we can do is, if it's greater than 0, then return, or if the last sent inputs, or actually, we don't, we actually have to do that here. If the last sent inputs is equal to the new inputs, right? Then we just return. Nothing to send. But we don't want to reset the time to sync, right? Now, basically, if nothing happens for longer than 100 milliseconds, once something happens, we want to immediately send that. So now what we can actually do is we don't have to put this anymore, because now we're actually only logging this whenever we really send something. And then at the very end, we have to say last sent inputs is the same as inputs, right? And so now, let's see, we shouldn't see anything, right? We see nothing. Now if we move, let's see, we move a little bit. Now we sent, it was submitting the angle, right? And now if I apply thrust, it also sends it, right? If I apply thrust again, it sends again with the same angle, right? So, okay, so there's a problem, right? So basically what happened is that the last inputs had thrust true. We didn't change anything but thrust. So that doesn't work either. So basically if we didn't apply thrust, if you did apply thrust, we always have to send that. So if we did not apply thrust and the inputs are the same, then we shouldn't send those, right? So now let's try this again. So we're sending this, we're sending thrust once, and I send it multiple times. Oh, because so basically, we don't really care. Yeah, we don't really care if like we didn't apply thrust. We don't have to send that to the server. It's more like so that's the difference, right? The angle is actually like a state, and the applied thrust is more like an event. We only want to send that once that happens, but we don't want to send didn't apply thrust. That doesn't make sense to us. So actually what we can do, we can change this. This is a little hacky, but what we can do is, so we set it to inputs, but at the same time, so what we will do actually, we'll make to make it a little less hacky, we'll have we can assign something, copy, and we'll say without events, right? So we can say, give me some new player inputs, copy without events. So that means that basically, let's just say clone. And so what we're going to do, we're going to return basically what we have, but we're going to create a new player inputs, except that we totally ignore the applied thrust, right? So all we do is we set the angle to whatever our angle is, and I guess we don't need that. And the applied thrust we don't set, except we set it to false, right? We should set it to false. Yeah, so we always set this to false, so the so we never send right? So you may never send it again because the applied thrust was different. Shouldn't do that. So clone without, we call it clone without events for now. So basically what we do is last sentence is dot clone without events. And so now we don't have to basically do that either, because now they're not going to be equal, because the previous equal inputs will always be the same as long as we don't apply thrust. Once we apply thrust, then they'll be different. So this should actually work. This is a little hacky. I'm not a huge fan of this. But now, and the interesting thing is that we're actually sending it. We're sending it like numerous times. But I mean, this is actually really fast. So maybe we can change in our game props how often we send events, because that seems to me 100 milliseconds. So maybe we can actually make that 500 milliseconds. So let's see. It seems to, I see that's something. Okay. Let's clear the log and let's see what happens if I apply thrust. Still getting 2 submits. There's some other problem going on here. Why are we getting Why are we getting 2 submits here going on? So the times are basically not large enough, I think. I mean, it's definitely not. We're sending definitely like within 1 second, right? We're sending multiples. And it looks to me like those are like 10 milliseconds or something. So something is not right here. So let's see. So because if you do this like clone without events, then the last one will be false, but we should never, that should never matter. So why are we submitting inputs so often? Let's log a little bit here what's going on. So when we're submitting, right? So let's also log our DT. And then time to next thing. Okay, let's see. DT is, yeah, is that, and time next is 0, yes, okay. So, and then after we're submitting, let's just change this to submitted, right? And then actually what we should see is that it sets it back to time to next is 100. It's still 100. Oh, it didn't reload. It didn't reload the game props. That's where we need to actually do a hard restart. Instead of a hard, so now we get a 500 there, right? So it's still submitting twice. And you can see it's actually doing it and waiting. So submitting it twice for whatever reason. But why exactly twice? It's only called once. So you can see, like, so let's just go and make this really obvious. We'll set it to like 3000, right? Do a hard restart. And so this, it'll only submit once, right? So we change it. And we can actually see like things are not really working that well now. Because the server updates come in much quicker than we're actually sending our updates. So that makes sense. So you can see that it sends it once and then it waits 3 seconds and then it sends it again. So we must have some bug here with the last send inputs. Let's look at the equal methods again. That was magically implemented for us. So they are equal if both of these properties are equal. That makes sense to me. But I think that's basically what's causing the problem. But it is sending applied thrust true twice. So that's also odd, right? Because the player applied thrust should have been... I think that's what's happening, maybe. That doesn't make sense, so. Because it should basically like skip it. Oh, I know why. It's because we are setting this field to true right away after we just set it to false. If that makes sense. So when you press it, basically, this field gets set to true. And no matter what the model says, we are setting it to false. We keep it true. And so that's the problem. Yeah, so that's the problem. So if you just only do this, let's see what happens here. No, we only send it once. I see like 3000. We can probably make this shorter now because I think we identified the problem. Okay, we're sending thrust one time. Oh, it's still okay. We have to do a hard restart instead of a hard reload. So let's try this. We're sending it once. We're sending it twice. Now if I press, a lot of times you actually send it twice. It's almost like I can't press it fast enough to where it becomes a problem. So I think like this whole keeping this around is not really that necessary. Especially because we might just already be expired without time to next sync and we just submit it immediately. So let's just remove this field entirely. And do this. And so we don't need to do this anymore. So we can rotate, that gets sent immediately, it looks okay. Now if we apply thrust, we're still submitting false for some reason. Let's clear this. We're submitting true twice. So we almost want to make this larger, right? Because we don't want to submit it twice that many times. So I don't know why it's submitting it. Let me clear this. Submitted once. Okay, submitted once. So I don't know if you can hear me clicking. I'm clicking once, it submits once. Okay, but if I hold it a little longer, then it submits twice. It's almost like we want a different. I was actually thinking that would be, yeah, almost we want like a, we don't want to allow the player to submit thrust more than once every half seconds or something. So we need to figure that one out a little bit. So when we are processing the inputs, we need to say, I don't care if you applied thrust, you cannot apply thrust if you just applied thrust a millisecond ago. So we can actually do that. We can keep this guy around and can say, basically, we'll have like a getter. And we actually make that public because some other people might be interested in that too. So we have this as a getter. And so what do we need to? We need to figure out if the last time, so basically we say that, so we say here static const, and we say time between thrusts in milliseconds, and then we'll say you can only do so every 500 milliseconds. Okay, so then we can say we get this passed into us here. So final double time between thrusts, and so we can take that here as a parameter. All right, and now we can say we have another double, and we say time since last thrust, right? And we'll set this to 0 first. As we can do this in the constructor, it's probably cleaner. Okay. All right. Why is it complaining still? I'm not sure. We'll figure it out. So can apply thrust. We'll say return times since last thrust is greater than time between thrusts, right? Somehow it doesn't like something and it's not correctly. So we can actually say if it cannot be, if you can apply not apply thrust, then just return. We just ignore, right? But we'll also have to keep track of. Basically, we have to add dt to this, right? So we say time since last thrust is, and we do the same thing. We don't want to overflow here. In this case, it's going to be min. Time between thrusts and time since last thrust plus dt. All right. And it has to be greater or equal. Well, I mean, don't want to. Hopefully, we're not going to get any rounding errors, but we shouldn't. So we say here equals, okay. No, oh, sorry. The time since last thrust, yeah, should be, this is wrong. Time between thrusts, right? Or we can just say, even easier, time between thrusts is smaller. Kind of the same thing, right? So, I want to see why something is... Okay, we need to declare this without... Alright, so now it's finally formatting. So now all we need to do is we're updating this here already. So now actually this should already work. Oh no, we need to still, inside here, we need to inject this thing. So we can say time between thrusts game props dot time between thrusts. Alright, so now if we refresh and it's complaining, this might be because because we needed a hot restart here for that one. So okay, we got that. Now we're gonna clear the console and apply a thrust. Okay, so I pressed it. It's still not working for some reason. It's still sending it twice. Let's see why this is. Oh, no, it needs to be... Yeah, we got that. No, that's actually correct. Oh, we need to reset it to 0, right? So once we actually apply the thrust, if we do apply one, so we say time thrust is... Oh no, time since last thrust, right? Equals 0.0. Do the same thing here. Now this should actually work. So we apply thrust, and I'm pressing a little longer, and it all needed once. And I'm pressing long, I'm pressing really long. So you can see now if I'm gonna actually keep the key held down, and now I can see that we're actually really throttling thrusts. Okay, that's good. So this is pretty good. I mean, we're not sending anything to the server yet, or we are maybe, but the server is not reacting. So what I actually want to do though is I want to focus on the client first here. I want to see if you can get the thrust animation going. But what I want to do first, I want to check this in. I want to see what we changed here. So so we added this one, yes, and then this is all about like basically we are throttling the thrust, right? Let's see. So this is low. This is kind of orthogonal to this. So this is almost like a separate check-in, even though it kind of all got fixed together. So yeah, so these two, and let's see what this one is. Oh yeah, so these two actually are kind of related, and yeah. So I actually want to check this in separately, and I'm going to say that something like that. Yeah, this is fine like this. We just check it in like that. Don't want to overcomplicate the message here. And so then this one here is basically throttling the thrust. Or we just call it inputs. Okay, so we're throttling thrust. By the way, my chat room is always open here. I'm keep looking at it. If any questions arise about what we're doing here, let me know. I'm happy to answer. So, what else do I want to see? So we got this, and now I wanted to see that maybe in the player controller, or actually in the, so we start from the client game best. So here we have basically the update, which is the, where we basically update the controllers, and then we basically have the update UI, right? And so the thing is like, update sprites is basically looking if the player applied thrust, right? But by the time that happens, the game controller already unset it. We saw this. Like if we look at the player controller, we can see that it already did at this point unset it, which is not cool, because now the client, and for the sake of animation, doesn't know anymore that the player did apply thrust. So it's almost like, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but it's almost like we want to I don't want to make this too complicated, and also I don't want to take too many shortcuts. So we're processing the inputs, right? And then we update the inputs, basically update the model. Then what I also don't understand is why the velocity doesn't change, and that might be because maybe we aren't that part I don't understand either. So actually what should happen is, right, if we apply thrust, we should actually apply velocity. So let's fix that first, because that should happen anyways, right? So here we should actually increase the player velocity, and then the player should start moving. So I'm not sure why that's not happening. Oh, by the way, let's simplify a little bit the logging here that we have in the player inputs. We're logging a little bit busy. I think it's an input processor. The input synchronizer there. So, all right. So here we're logging, like, we want to basically just show the inputs that we are submitting, because now we fixed that bug. So now, actually now this will look a little bit simpler, right? Okay. And probably don't even need to print that we submitted anything. We can just do this like this. And then also what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the inputs. I'm going to clean up that toString function a little bit. But I want to keep that log around actually, because it is helpful too. So what I want to do though is, well, let's just do it this way. We know that the double must be the angle, and that the Boolean must be the applied thrust. And if we have more Booleans, we can always change that. So I want to kind of do it like this and put a comma, and then now that is much less noisy, right? Right. So okay, I like that. I don't understand why there has to be a new line. Let's see why. Is that maybe just because it doesn't fit? Okay, yeah, it doesn't fit. Okay, so we do it like that. That looks much cleaner now. So we see like what inputs we are submitting. So we are definitely submitting. If we apply thrust, that definitely is registered and even submitted. What I don't understand is why then here we don't increase the velocity, right? So if we're going to add another log, and we're going to log that the velocity got increased here. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to Let's see what normalized velocity does. It just rounds it. I mean, that's... I hope the rounding is not the culprit here. That maybe... Oh, that could actually be the case, right? Because what I'm thinking now is that I'm actually going to put a log here, and I'm saying applied thrust. What I'm thinking now is that maybe our rounding is rounding it back to 0 because our thrust value is not large enough. So if we go to game props, we can see that the thrust force is this small. Yeah, and that gets basically rounded away. So I don't even need to log. That means we need to apply a thrust force of at least that much. Or, like, let's see what it actually does. When we increase the velocity, we're translating it by the force. Okay, so actually I don't want to go crazy because that will make us really fast. So let's actually keep it this way. But what I'm going to do is when we normalize the velocity here, and we did apply thrust, basically if the velocity is still too small, we need to make it basically at least something like 1, something like that. So basically when we increase the velocity here, we increase the velocity here, but we translate the velocity. Okay. So actually what we could do is we could say double min delta equals, and we make it like 0.1 because that's, we capture that, right? So this is an optional parameter, and actually let's make it named, I guess that's better. So let's do this. And so what we can do though then is that we can say that the delta x equals the maximum of the min delta, and in this calculation, and we do the same for y, and then we say, oh no, this is different, ya, okay, and then we say delta x delta y. So this way we ensure that the minimum speed up that we're getting is at least like what we basically don't round away. So 0.001 is the minimum that we need. So we're still not moving. I'm gonna log the velocity and the player velocity. So let's see, velocity and the p velocity, because I think something like that is going on. I'm not entirely sure, but that's what I want to fix first. Okay, so let's... Okay, so we need to probably do a hard restart. Nope. Oh, we need to, yeah, we need to dot, let's say finer. We really need to change our logger to where we say only log specific things. So okay, so let's see the velocity. Okay, so it's not the normalization. Well, it could be, right? Because no, I don't know. Like, I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to game props, and I'm going to increase that value a little bit. So I'm going to make this a lot bigger. I'm just basically doing this figure out what's going on. So let's do this, and let's do a hard restart because it's a game props change. So anytime we change the static classes, we actually have to do a hard restart. Something is not right. Increase the velocity. We take the player velocity, take the player angle, and we take the thrust force. Okay, the thrust force, and the thrust force is given to us here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to see. No, yeah, I'm going to put a breakpoint. I'm going to stop this. This one here, and I'm going to launch this again in debug. Well, that wasn't a good idea because debug mode doesn't work on Mac. So, okay, let's instead what we'll do is we'll log some more things out. So we log the thrust force as well, because maybe that's not set correctly. Let's see, thrust. Because I'm thinking that maybe if that is 0, that would obviously also be a problem. So maybe we are just not saying this correctly. Okay. So let's change this. Let's reload. And now let's see. I guess it didn't pick up that change yet. Let's do a restart. It's not logging this. Maybe there's, oh, because it's an error. Okay. All right. Thrust was 0.05, that's correct. Now the velocity is 0. Okay, so the velocity changed. It just stays really, really small. It actually makes sense. We were pointing here and we are... So basically what we're saying is that we're setting this... Yeah, so that's the problem, right? Because... Actually, it shouldn't be the problem, because if we keep translating about delta by 0.1, it should actually add 0.1, right? So it should be 0.1, 0.2. Even though we're not moving it for whatever reason, that's another issue. Because if we actually translate, right, it adds to the current version value, and so we should actually get larger and larger values. But then maybe when we normalize, maybe our rounding is off. So what if we just, for now, disable this function and just set back the velocity, just to make sure that this is not the problem. Right? So let's do that. No, that doesn't seem to be the problem. Let's make sure this is actually really applying. This is not the problem. I'm not sure what's going on, to be quite honest. I have no real idea why this is not working as expected. So, but we're at the end of the hour, and I want to keep those to reasonable length. I just really don't understand why this is happening. Okay. Basically, we're setting the check before, right? We're checking before. And then afterwards we actually calculate the velocity, but then we override it again with the check. So this is not how it should be. We need to set the velocity. And again, this is like if you have immutable data structures, you just cover these easier. So you have a bunch of code that looks like it's kind of like really ugly, but at least that code prevents something. Okay, now we are flying. Okay, now obviously the server still thinks we are somewhere. All right. So the server doesn't get our update yet. But the server might actually have the same problem. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart the server as well. Because now we might actually have fixed it. Because this is the same controller that runs on the server, right? So if you fix it here, the server might actually apply the movement. So if I restart the server, but you see now what happens if the server does not get the changes, right? Or sorry, if the server doesn't basically update the display the same way we are on the client, then we get this effect. So let's move. All right. Yes. This means we are actually now. So did you see that little correction there? Okay, that's fine. Because when we apply the thrust, and that's what I wanted to point out, is like if we have. So you also see that. So when we apply the thrust, the server moves us somewhere else because you're still pointing. So you can see that. So we still have a bunch of problems there. Mainly because the server doesn't know which way we're facing, apparently. Even though we're sending those inputs regularly. It seems like the server still thinks we're pointing the other way. What I also want to do, though, I want to remove this this min delta thing. We might not. Well, actually, it's fine. We probably it's not hurting anything. But you can see, so I'm moving. So that seems correct. Now I'm moving. And it seems to not take the angle that we're actually pointing into account. So it seems like the server is not really aware where we're pointing and in which direction we're applying the thrust. So we can fix that in the next episode. But at least we got applying thrust working again. So that's the good news. And so in the next episode, we'll figure out why the server is basically accelerating us in a different direction than we are pointing, which is clearly happening, right? So we are, or maybe if we even turn off the server updates, if we ignore those, right? If we go to the synchronizer, not that one, there's a methods thing. I always forget where that is. So I'm just going to try that real quick. Oops, did we find it? Right, so I'm not going to sync the game state. I'm just going to return. Just for now. So now our client should no longer. It's still not working. So let's do a hard restart actually. So at this point, the client basically doesn't sync itself with server at all. Oh, actually, it needs to sync itself the first time, right? Yeah, so basically what we can do, we can make a constant here, const sync only white, and this is just for debugging purposes. And we can set this to true, and then we can say if sync only once, and we can say bool synced equals false, and synced and not synced, then we update this, right? And then we set synced equals true. And so now we should have a way to quickly say that we don't want to sync after we sync once. So now, okay, so this seems to be actually a problem maybe this is something we introduced here with our little. That's why I wanted to go into this real quick. And I think this delta thing is probably causing more problems than it's helping. So let's just undo everything we did here. Yep. Okay. Now we're back to normal. So now let's see if that works. All right. Now we're moving, right? So we didn't need that, what we had there. And now actually it's working. So we can see that something with this delta thing didn't really work well. Don't have time to figure that out and why at this point, but that's what was going on. Now if I set this to false, now it should keep syncing from the server. We should actually see a little jump once in a while when the server is basically a little bit, why is this? Oh, if, let's turn this a little on its head. Hold on. If, okay, this is getting too complicated. If not synced or not sync only once, right? Then we don't do this. Why is it complaining? All right. So now actually what should happen is we move. Yeah, and we saw that update there, right? But at least now we are accelerating this way. And you see like the server is a little bit out of touch with what we're doing. Because it's basically getting the thrust later and all the things. So now we're starting to see like what happens if the server is really slow. Or if like basically the updates like basically if the latency gets really large. You can see that. So it seems like, oh, you know why? Because on the server we still have that other thing running. So on the server it's still doing the wrong things. So I was expecting some jumps, but not quite as big. So let me restart this guy, and this is the last thing we'll do, and then we'll shut down the episode. But I just wanted to see this work. So now we can see that there should be some jumps. Now when we don't do anything, we are kind of sync. But now we did this. Well, okay. So we saw a jump, right? Right, but that's basically also because the server. Yeah, so that's a little bit tricky, right? You have to see how to mitigate this. But that's for next time. So thank you for watching. We made some progress. I'm going to actually check this in before we turn off the episode. And what we basically did, so here, okay, so this is a separate one, right? Basically, we're supporting to sync only once. So I'm going to actually check that one in separately. So that's the client, or like sync, or like server. That's one commit, and then so we changed the thrust force, which turned out to be good. So actually we probably want to do that as a separate one, maybe two. So this one is kind of has nothing to do with anything in a way. We'll just append that to our commit, and then here we basically fix the we fixed applying the thrust, right? Right, or like let's say fixed order of applying velocity. It sounds better. All right, cool. So now our player is moving finally again. We don't see a thrust animation yet, but we'll fix that next time. We know why this is not working. But I think before we even do that, we might actually go ahead and try to fix these jumps and actually try to understand the jumps, right? So, right, this is not necessarily for writing the game the quickest way and just like, making it work. We're trying to understand how you would write a game and how you would debug things and kind of also understand like the problems you run into, right? So we are actually not taking the easiest route. We are making this more realistic than probably need be, but that's just so we can run into all the issues that real games also run into and we can learn from it. So thank you for watching, and make sure to come back for the next episode. And if you're on Twitch, I'll be here tomorrow night as well, so make sure to come back. Thank you.